afternoon, everyone. Hey, folks, let's get going if we could, please. Thanks so much for being here. And if you're out in the hall, come on in and do join. Welcome to the final event of the Engaged English Research Forum for 2023-24. We've had a really incredible year being challenged by so many great thinkers, creative artists, scholars, and I'm really grateful for the time that we've spent together in rooms like this. This being one of the nicest of those rooms, and we're very happy to be here at the University Club. A few thank yous I'd like to give before we get rolling officially. To Rob and Trevor from Kingston Soundworks, who've done such great work partnering with us on a number of events. We really appreciate your expertise and the way that you've responded so diligently to the various hiccups that we've placed in front of you. Thanks to Jessica Traynor, who has me trained in her camera's eye at the very moment that I'm thanking her, for all of the tireless work that you've done to bring our intellectual community out into the world beyond us. Our socials, I guess they're called, are so much enriched by the care that you've given them, and so we're really, really thankful. And to Meg Bryan, who does incredible work on all aspects of our department, but particularly the amount of time and effort and planning that goes into all of these events is really quite staggering. So we're grateful for all you do, so thanks for that. So the Sister Sophie lecture series is the brainchild of an alumna of our graduate program, Silu Yang, who is really dedicated to bringing the best of what humanities scholarship is to those in the Queen's community, but then beyond as well. And we are grateful to the Sister Sophie Elite Education Institute for the generous support that makes this event possible. So the vision for this series is to showcase the value, relevance, and power of advanced studies in English literature by bringing renowned international scholars to Queen's to share their important work, and thereby to celebrate humanities scholarship and what all you as grad students are entering into or have entered into and are aspiring toward. And that vision is certainly coming true with the visiting speaker we have with us today, and we're grateful for the opportunity to learn in the moments ahead of us. But I'm not doing that introduction. I'm just introducing the series proper. And all this to say, we are grateful to Silu for that vision, for that commitment to what humanities scholarship does in the world. And with that, I will turn things over to my colleague and friend, Ranjani Chatterjee, to introduce our visiting speaker.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Ranjani Chatterjee, and I teach here in the English department at Queen's. Many of you probably know me, and I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker today, Professor Yogita Goyal. So Yogita Goyal is Professor of English and African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She specializes in modern and contemporary literature and the study of race and postcolonialism. Her first book, Romance, Diaspora, and Black Atlantic Literature, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 2010, shifts the center of Black diaspora studies by considering Africa as constitutive of Black modernity rather than its forgotten past. She's guest editor of the special issue of Research in African Literatures on Africa and the Black Atlantic, and editor of the Cambridge Companion to Transnational American Literature. She's editor of the journal Contemporary Literature and past president of the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present. And Professor Goyal's most recent book, Runaway Genres, The Global Afterlives of Slavery, which came out with NYU Press in 2019, tracks the emergence of slavery as the defining template through which current forms of human rights abuses are understood. To fathom forms of freedom and bondage today, this project reads a vast range of contemporary literature, showing how the literary forms used to tell these stories derive from the antebellum genre of the slave narrative. showing how slavery provides the occasion not just for revisiting the Atlantic past, but for re-narrating the global present. Runaway Genres creates a new map of contemporary Black diaspora literature. And the book received the Renee Wellick Prize from ACLA, the Perkins Prize from the International Society for the Study of Narrative, and honorable mention for the James Russell Lowell Prize from MLA. And truly, this is just a small sampling of Professor Goyal's accolades, as well as the sort of impactful ongoing work that she's doing, and which I understand we'll be hearing from today. So please join me in welcoming our speaker. Professor, if you'll be taking it up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? So I'd also like to start with some thank yous. I should move this a little bit. I'd like to start with thanking Meg Bryan for arranging my trip and all of the logistics. I'd, of course, like to thank Sam for his hospitality and for making this possible, and Ranjani for that very generous introduction, and to all of you for coming in. This is very much, as Ranjani sort of hinted, a new project, and this is sort of only the second time that I'm sharing it publicly, so I'm very excited to hear your thoughts. The talk is called Failed States, Failed Genres, and I'll just get going. Perhaps the most influential account of the failure of decolonization is David Scott's lament that, quote, anti-colonial utopias have gradually withered into post-colonial nightmares. When the bankruptcy of post-colonial regimes is palpable in the extreme, Scott writes, in other words, when the potential of radical nationalism, socialism, and revolutionary transformations is exhausted, how can we not conclude that, like Hamlet, our time is out of joint? Scott channels Raymond Williams's writings on modern tragedy to lament that our time suffers from, quote, the loss of hope, the slowly settling loss of any acceptable future. That is to say, the failure of mid-20th century decolonization to reverse colonial plunder, to redeem a collective past, and to plot a livable future weighs down our present conjuncture with the burden of unrealized hopes and the dread of impending doom. I want to push back against what I think is a widespread tendency to conflate the historical failure of national liberation to bring about social and economic transformation with the failure of post-colonial theory to grasp past, present, and future forms of empire. The dominant critical trap today is this allure of narratives of failure. And while current critical fascination with the failure of decolonization comes from a different conceptual vocabulary, I worry that it echoes the deeply flawed discourse around failed states that gained currency in the wake of 1989. Labels like Failed State Index, which has recently been retitled Fragile State Index, only anoint the West as the norm from which the post-colony is destined to deviate, unable to climb the ordained ladder of development and frozen in Manichaean opposition to an equally static first world. I don't want to minimize the profound failure of the post-colonial nation state, but I'm troubled by rhetoric that conflates the failure of the nation as a container for hope, the failure of decolonization movements in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean as a politics, and the failure of post-colonial studies as a field. This is where it's helpful to recall Anne Stoller's suggestion in Duress that political concepts both conceal the scenes of their making and intervene in the allocation of power. She thus invites us to contest the naturalization of the noun colony to the extent that it does not seem like a political concept at all, and to further theorize its persistence into the present. Accordingly, we need to assess the status of anti-colonial thought and its expansive reach into our catastrophic present. At a moment when decolonization is becoming a watchword for many distinct communities, how might we reevaluate the mid-20th century writings of such influential thinkers as Amilcar Cabral, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Claudia Jones, and Patrice Lumumba, to name just a few, on the one hand, and to theorize the morphing character of post-colonial studies in the 21st century on the other. So to do so, I turn to Scott's Conscripts of Modernity, precisely because he's emphatic about a break between these two eras, anti and post. For him, and these are his words, the old languages of moral, political vision, and hope are no longer in sync with the world they were meant to describe and normatively criticize. Because we are now in a different problem space, he insists, quote, we need to give up constructing an image of colonialism that demands from us an attitude of anti-colonial longing, a longing for anti-colonial revolution. This is precisely the spirit that has returned with a vengeance today, some 20 years later. an attitude of anti-colonial longing, a longing for anti-colonial revolution. In recent celebrated African diaspora novels like No Violet Bulawayo's Glory, which came out in 2022, Maza Mengiste's Shadow King from 2019, and Mbolombwe's How Beautiful We Were from 2021, rescripting the fates of Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and Cameroon, respectively. Scott's argument hinges on a virtuosic reading of C.L.R. James's monumental study, The Black Jacobins, and changes in the text from 1938 to 1963, when James adds a few paragraphs on tragedy in his account of Toussaint's defeat, imprisonment, and death. James's Toussaint for Scott is not Caliban, but Hamlet, quote, a modernist intellectual suffering like Hamlet, the modern fracturing of thought and action. Scott resists anti-colonial stories plotted as a romance, narratives of overcoming, salvation, redemption, where he writes, history rides a triumphant and seamlessly progressive rhythm. In contrast, tragedy does not conceive of past, present, and future, these are again Scott's words, as moments of epic succession. They do not line up neatly as though history were heading somewhere, from bondage to freedom, from despair to triumph. While romance assumes that, quote, we are masters and mistresses of our destiny, that our pasts can be left behind and new future is leaped into, end quote, tragedy reckons with forces beyond our control, with vulnerability, chance, and contingency. So I'm going to suggest that there's more to be said about the genres of anti-colonialism than assuming that romance is redemptive while tragedy is remorseless. I say this to posit a different relationship between the anti-colonial and post-colonial conjunctures, where the unfinished quest for decolonization can indeed continue to animate our visions of futurity. Part of the claim is that we need to expand our understanding of the varied genres of anti-colonial thought. For instance, the manifesto, the elegy, satire, farce, allegory, and so much more. As we know, particularly in post-colonial studies, debates about nation as narration, the national longing for form, and third world literature as national allegory have been foundational, calling attention to the tight link between the individual and the larger collective. The novel as a genre has always occupied pride of place in such discussions, as its specific alliance with modernity, its ability to stage interiority and psychological depth, its history of amalgamating borrowed forms, inextricably linked it to national liberation and its disappointments. And in this context, I always think of George Lamming, when in Pleasures of Exile, he lists the three most important events in Anglophone Caribbean history. The first for him is the discovery by Columbus, the end of slavery and the influx of Indian and Chinese labor. The discovery is the first, the end of slavery and the influx of labor is the second, and third, this is Lamming, the discovery of the novel by West Indians as a way of projecting the inner experiences of the West Indian community. So, very small claim there for the novel. I want to take seriously the possibility that the contemporary African diaspora novel continues to provide a space for the exploration of intricate inner lives, for analyses of social and economic transitions, for new cartographies of self and other. Now, I've written elsewhere about the many transformations of romance in Black Atlantic thought, transformations that interrupt the temporality of redemption. Conceptions of diaspora that reckon with loss and fracture often conceive of the relation between past, present, and future differently, as diaspora time can certainly be recursive and messianic, but it can also be characterized by rupture or by imagined simultaneities. The work of cultural reconstruction, remembrance, or repair doesn't always take place in linear fashion. Romance may involve nostalgia, idealization, and heroic narratives of struggle, but as Jameson insists in The Political Unconscious, it can also offer the possibility of sensing other historical rhythms, free, this is Jameson, from that reality principle to which a now oppressive realistic representation is the hostage. If we don't assume that genres are transhistorical entities and not just a kind of shorthand, but are about participation in a collective initiative, as Derrida has taught us, if they enable recognition, as Todorov demonstrates, they can reframe our horizons of meaning and dreaming, paving our paths to political knowledge. Thinking of genre as epistemology allows us to see patterns of thinking emerge across time and space, to glean how history is sedimented in these patterns, and to imagine alternatives to the pervasive rhetoric of failure. In an era when all that is certain is the coming disaster, perhaps the romance of anti-colonial revolution could indeed remain generative. So I want to think about a more expansive narrative of the genres of anti-colonial thought. Black Jacobins famously revises stories of the failure of slave revolts, teaching us that, quote, Toussaint's failure was the failure of enlightenment, not of darkness. And as Rachel Douglas recently argues, James's many instances of writing and rewriting his account of the Haitian Revolution encapsulate the dynamic of revolutionary process. The book is unfinished and provisional. It can never be finished, like the revolution itself. The much wider archive of anti-colonial writing similarly writes and rewrites the meaning of success and failure, making it imperative for us to revisit how today's world has been shaped by that seismic mid-century cataclysm, still poorly absorbed into our historical consciousness or into our visions of post-colonial futures. Any number of works from that era are subsequently seen as prescient. We could think of Fanon, Richard Wright, Achebe, Ngugi, Soyinka, Arma Aidu. The failure of African political leadership in the era of nation building is a twice-told tale. But when we turn to something like the South African writer Peter Abrahams' stunning series of novels about Pan-Africanism and national liberation, and I'm thinking of two in particular, Erythro Domo from 1956 and This Island Now from 1966, we find something of value that exceeds the diagnosis of failure, the awareness of tragedy, or the hymn of despair. Similarly, the many returns to the martyred figure of Patrice Lumumba, from Césaire's A Season in the Congo to Adrian Kennedy's Funny House of a Negro to Raoul Peck's documentaries, these have purposes other than the prophecy of failure. Nkrumah's spectacular rise and fall have been anatomized endlessly, again by Abrams and Kennedy, by Wright and Fanon, but also by Nkrumah himself in Neocolonialism and by James in Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. Not only do such works invite us to assess anti-colonial revolutions from the horizon of their eventual success, they variously excavate the complex causes of failure, attributing it either to the cultural tendencies of a people or to global dynamics of resource extraction or to the logic of dependency. For Abrams in Erythro Domo and for Wright in Black Power, for example, tribalism remains the greatest threat to African independence and forced modernization the remedy. In contrast, abstractionist or experimental meditations like those of Kennedy probe the very meaning of human life and the absurdity of desire. These differences matter. Each of these works proposes a theory of colony as concept, of collectivity and desire, of governance and impossibility. Writers from that era didn't just foretell failure or succumb to romance and neglect tragedy. They insisted on utopia and commitment, antagonism and introspection. This is also how I understand W.B. Du Bois's famous claim in Black Reconstruction. If Reconstruction failed, Du Bois insists, it was a splendid failure. Rescripting the Dunning School of History, which saw Reconstruction not as a general strike, but as, quote, a travesty of democracy, an era of corruption and misgovernment, in the vein of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, Du Bois skillfully outlined the folly of insisting that emancipated enslaved people should acquire land by working for wages like everyone else in a market society, and how the political revolution went forward, but the economic revolution was stymied. Reconstruction did not fail for the reason its critics assumed it would fail, Black inadequacy. It failed because the white working class refused to learn that its interests were bound up with the Black working class. Du Bois thus meets Scott's terms by seeing Reconstruction as a tragedy and not a romance. But the tragedy for him was that it failed, not that it was attempted. Similarly, I want to suggest that our goal should be to fulfill the aspirations of decolonization, not dismiss them as outmoded or constitutively flawed. We could remember here James's poignant dedication in Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. The book is dedicated to Francis. Like Cromwell and Lenin, he initiated the destruction of a regime in decay, a tremendous achievement. But like them, he failed to create the new society. Note how tempered his assessment of Nkrumah's historical failure is here. First, restoring the grandiosity of the achievement of freedom, insisting on its world historical significance, and mourning the unfinished charge without giving up on its utopian possibility. The story of anti-colonialism, whether narrated as romance or tragedy, continues to focus on a few great men, as I have just done, and often on very selected readings of these figures. However we see them now, heroes, traitors, despots, conscripts of an alien modernity, harbingers of post-colonial melancholy, our turn to these familiar figures perhaps keeps us trapped in circular debates. I'm hoping that in turning now to Lorraine Hansberry, the celebrated young, gifted, and Black author of Raisin in the Sun, a play often misunderstood to her chagrin as advocating liberal integration, I can recognize her as an astute theorist of anti-colonialism. Like Fanon, she also died at the very young age of 34 and was passionately committed to the cause of African liberation. Almost all critics of her play, Le Blanc, have commented on her extraordinarily prophetic vision. She anticipates the future that was to unfold in decolonizing Africa evincing what Cheryl Higashida calls feminist queer investments in Black national liberation. Nina Simone famously recalled getting a political education from her friend Lorraine. This is Nina Simone. When we got together, it was always Marx, Lenin, and revolution. Real girls talk. Hansberry's play, drafted by 1966, completed by Robert Nemiroff, was first performed in New York City in 1970. The play gathers many anti-colonial strands of her thinking, variously fostered by her education with Du Bois. So she wrote a research paper for him on the Belgian Congo, her editorial and journalistic work with Paul Robeson's magazine Freedom, and her voracious reading of African history and politics, including Jomo Kenyatta's Facing Mount Kenya, Du Bois's Black Folk Then and Now, Basil Davidson's Lost Cities of Africa, and her uncle William Leo Hansberry's numerous writings on African civilization. And we may remember that Leo Hansberry taught two future African heads of state, Nkrumah and Azikiwe. Imani Perry recently reminds us how Hansberry wrote to the New York Times Magazine, apologizing to Patrice Lumumba's widow when Lumumba was killed in response to Ralph Bunche's conciliatory gestures. Hansberry was galvanized by a visceral reaction to Jean Genet's celebrated play, translated as The Blacks, a Clown Show from 1961, and was determined to write in counterpoint to what she termed a conversation between white men about themselves. Set in the fictional country of Zatembe, the action of the play revolves around an isolated hospital-come mission at a moment of anti-colonial awakening and the brutal colonial repression of the uprising. The play roughly mimics the historical events surrounding the Mau Mau rebellion in colonial Kenya. Kumalo, a hazy Kenyatta-like figure, remains off stage, though rumors of his return from exile proliferate. Hansberry rebuts Genet's absurdist engagement with Black liberation. She saw him as persisting in a kind of romantic racism by setting a Shakespearean tragedy in anti-colonial Africa, thus meeting Scott's criteria of tragedy, but reaching very different conclusions. Not a romance of diaspora, nor a romance of overcoming, nor preoccupied by the familiar question of what is Africa to me, sounded by so many from County Cullen onward, but a clear-eyed look at anti-colonial revolution. The play is incredibly subtle. No character has moral clarity. There are heroes and villains, to be sure, but no caricatures. And despite the critical response to the play, so critics claim that the play boiled down to saying kill Whitey and advocated genocide, Hansberry is unafraid to cut her Black protagonist to size to imbue the clueless white American journalist with sympathy. She differentiates among white settlers in Zatembe based on their politics, which range from true feelings of solidarity to customary colonial animosity to ambiguous longings for kinship. She also takes up the legacy of rape and violence across generations and probes questions of homosexuality and racial mixture. Hansberry had written elsewhere about the distortion of Kenya's Gikuyu as bloodthirsty terrorists practicing witchcraft by refocusing attention on British land grabs. In the name of civilization and Christianity, she shows how the British brought death, violence, humiliation, and famine. She writes, "When the Gikuyu protested, they were ignored. When they resisted, they were slaughtered." Tushembe Matose, the Hamlet-like figure at the center of the play, returns from England for his father's funeral. Torn between his cosmopolitan embrace of his white European wife and child and the demands of his family, he joins the anti-colonial struggle at the end of the play and kills his own brother, who is a convert to the Roman Catholic Church and despises native cultural practices, hoping to be the first Black archbishop. Just like James presents Toussaint as Hamlet, so does Hansberry. Her kaleidoscopic play insists that colonized Africans can become psychically whole only by joining the revolutionary struggle for freedom, no matter what sacrifice they have to make. And so you can see how similar it is to something like The Wretched of the Earth. There's much more to be said about the play than I have time for. I'll just note that we can also read the action of the play as speaking to the US context in the 1960s. So Tushembe's Hamlet-like indecision about joining the uprising could parallel MLK's struggle to navigate the mantle of leadership, while her strident critique of colonial Christianity echoes Malcolm X. Throughout her writings, she wanted African Americans to see their struggles as akin to those in Kenya, as part of a wider system of global racial formation and exploitation of labor. Although Le Blanc is styled as a Shakespearean tragedy, in contrast to Scott's view, the play maintains a clear sense of agency. History has a purpose, and her protagonist is able to make a moral choice, one that matters. Neither reducible to the nation-building project, nor to the self-authorizing function of anti-colonial autobiographies and fictions by future leaders of decolonized states, nor to the desires named by Bandung, the play focuses less on Aristotle's notion of the tragic flaw in our hero and more on historical contingencies that generate a series of bad choices. And yet it matters that her hero chooses revolution. So the play troubles how we see the genres of anti-colonial thought in generative ways. It mingles tragedy and romance with prophecy, satire, the oral fable, and farce. Just as Robin Kelly says in his preface to Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, the play is, quote, not a solution or a strategy or a little red book with pithy quotes. It is a dancing flame in a bonfire. Hansberry's play also benefits from being placed in dialogue with Facing Mount Kenya, published in 1938. And I should say that part of what I'm trying to do in this new book project is also to think about ethnography as a kind of genre of anti-colonial knowledge production. In Facing Mount Kenya, as part of a discussion of the Gikuyu system of land tenure, Jomo Kenyatta tells a story about a hyena. Once upon a time, an elephant made a friendship with a man. In a heavy thunderstorm, the elephant asks the man if he can come into his hut to stay dry. The man agrees. The elephant comes in, flings the man out into the rain, and usurps his hut. The king of the jungle, the lion, sets up an imperial commission of inquiry to adjudicate, made up of many animals, but no men, since, quote, no one from the man's side was well enough educated to understand the intricacy of jungle law. Let me cut to the chase. The commission allows the elephant to continue occupying the man's hut and asks the man to find another suitable hut. As soon as he builds another, the rhino takes it over. The story repeats itself with the leopard, the hyena, and the fox. Finally, the man builds a large new hut in which all the animals enter and try to claim as theirs. While they bicker, the man sets the hut on fire, burns it to the ground, and lives happily ever after. Now let's consider how Hansberry rewrites this story in her play, which is clearly an allegory for the European scramble for Africa and the constant refrain that the colonized are not ready for self-government. Modingo, a wise hyena, lives between the land of the elephants and that of the hyenas. The elephants claim more space because of their size. The hyenas resist because, quote, they had been first in that part of the jungle and were accustomed to running free. Modingo, Hamlet-like, deliberates. Yes, brothers, true, we were first in this land, but they do need space. Any fool can see that elephants are very large. And because I was born with the mark of reason on my brow, on which account I am called Modingo, one who thinks carefully before he acts, I cannot join you on our side while there is also justice on the other. While he thinks and thinks, the elephants gather their herds and drive the hyenas out of the jungle altogether. And Hansberry writes, that is why the hyena laughs until this day, and why it is such terrible laughter, because it was such a bitter joke that was played upon them while they reasoned. And so Tshembe is urged, we have waited 1,000 seasons for these guests to leave us, your people need you. If in Kenyatta's hyena story, the genre of the parable bolsters the romance of anti-colonial revolution, Hansberry adapts the tale as an allegory of the Fanonian native intellectual, the one who first chases westernization, then an abstract idea of the primitive native tradition, able to grasp only the outer garments of the people, not the teeming life within. Her play is not scripted around the leader himself, who never appears on stage, and her Hamlet is not a prince. The bitter laughter of her hyena is thus quite similar to the work Scott demands of the tragic mode, albeit shot through with a sense of absurdism. What I'm after here is Hansberry's rescripting of Kenyatta's anti-colonial ethnographic invention of tradition, where he is self-authorizing as what Simon Gikandi calls an Afro-Victorian. Her investments are different, as she is not establishing herself as the apt replacement for the missionaries and government officials, both figures of colonial encroachment in the play. Writing from the diaspora, she gives us a window into Pan-African epistemologies, a poetics of anti-colonialism that exceeds the logic of nation building, even as it sidesteps earlier territorial desires of Black imperial fantasies and liberal models of seemingly new world orders that maintain permanent dependency. Such concerns return in a startling way in our own era, as a number of African diaspora novelists, as I said earlier, today return to what Scott characterized as anachronistic, an attitude of anti-colonial longing, a longing for anti-colonial revolution. Robert Mugabe is perhaps the exemplary instance of the liberation hero turned authoritarian despot, underlining Scott's claim that anti-colonial utopias have withered into post-colonial nightmares. Novailet Bulawayo's Booker Prize shortlisted 2022 novel Glory sketches a detailed and at times delightful allegory of Mugabe's removal by coup in 2017. As we shift from Hansberry and Kenyatta to Bulawayo and Mugabe, from the dream of revolution to the nightmare of dictatorship, I suggest that the utopian longings of anti-colonialism persist, as Bulawayo reinvents received genres to take us out of the dyad of romance versus tragedy. The novel also features an animal allegory, but further draws on oral tales, farce, satire, diasporic return narratives, and the lingua franca of the internet, as the cacophony of something like Twitter stands in for the lost national public sphere. Glory conducts an anatomy of Mugabe's dictatorship and fall from power. Bitingly, it takes up the meaning of the failure of national liberation and its purchase on Zimbabwe's present. But the novel is, in contrast to Scott's notion of the hopelessness of our era, unencumbered by exhaustion or by the loss of hope or horizon. Glory teems with philosophies and characters, media and objects, riotously mingling history and fable, satire and salvage. The novel doesn't even seem nostalgic in any simple fashion, though thinking through its conception of time and history is key to its comic vision of a reimagined space of the nation. The notes of tragicomedy, the turn to the grotesque and the ribald, are perhaps nowhere better captured than in Bulawayo's incorporation of the rhythms of internet speech. For instance, one vignette in the novel captures hilarious responses from Zimbabwean citizens and expats to tweets from POTUS at Big Baboon of the US, who cannot even spell dictatorship correctly. These tweets undercuts any pretense the West could have of suggesting that authoritarian rule is the inevitable destiny of the post-colony and juxtapose democratic governance as the desired alternative. It also allows the public to respond in real time with hashtags like Never a Colony Again and remind Trump, the would-be dictator trying to copy his African counterpart, that he tweets from stolen land, among many more saucier insults. Both nations thus are undressed in any pretense of legitimate governance and moral authority or democratic rule. But the conversation also very easily and quickly departs from the US and devolves into internal disagreements among thinly disguised supporters of Mugabe and his successor, Mnangagwa. So sort of a rewriting of Animal Farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm, Mugabe is styled as an old horse, plagued by dementia, while his successor is given the name of General Tui, a play on the word for shit, also re-signifying Trump's shithole country's comment. While these authoritarian rulers justify their reigns of terror by saying, "Show me a nation that was born without blood," Bulawayo refuses to concede the terrain to them. Instead of a wholesale dismissal of the nation as a category, the novel dissociates the corrupt leaders from what it recuperates as the space of the national popular. The elite, including dictators and military leaders, have captured the nation-state for sure, and the novel energetically undermines and exposes their pretense to glory. Dressing them down as dogs, donkeys, cows, cats, ducks, horses, and goats, the novel uses exaggeration, farce, and surrealism to highlight the dysfunction and trauma caused by Mugabe and his defenders. Grace Mugabe, for instance, picks up the phone and orders a PhD to become Dr. Sweet Mother from the highest-ranked university in Jeddah, as if she's ordering from a KFC drive-thru, though the degree is indeed cheaper. We not only have a minister of revolution, but also a minister of corruption, minister of homophobic affairs, minister of disinformation, and minister of looting. A chapter called Past, Present, Future, Past, with future crossed out, underlines the cyclical nature of a dystopian history, one which makes any conventional realist plotting untenable. In contrast, the chorus of the novel serves as the voice of we the people of Jeddah. They are neither uncritically romanticized, nor are they dismissed as naive. Rather, the reader watches their political education as they navigate the wreckage of decades of authoritarian rule and the political chaos that ensues, even as nominally elections are held. They begin with the claim that, quote, "Us Jeddahdans are in our very nature peaceful animals." But the crushed hopes, betrayed dreams, the broken promise of independence changes them. When Mugabe is deposed in a coup, they feel like they're being robbed of the starring role in the movie of their life. Bulawayo writes, "Somewhere deep in us we felt robbed, left out of our own story. But their complicated joy gathers the memories of all who've been lost and killed and exiled, as they gloat that after all, leadership is not sexually transmitted, and they pose for selfies with soldiers on the liberated streets." Nature itself responds to this chorus. When elections promise a new day, flowers bloom everywhere in the land. When Tui usurps power, the people realize that change is an illusion. We shriek, we roar, we charge. We are a mad, writhing sea roaring. The brutal crushing of rebellion and protest leads to, quote, "wounded flesh, blood in the streets, blood in the gutters, screams. Up in the sky, clouds turn the color of bruises. And the air so hot, So thick with tear gas, we cannot see, we cannot breathe. And so here we can also see a call to Eric Garner and the protests that followed in the African American context. And of course, Bulawayo's first novel, We Need New Names, is a really important examination of the new African diaspora. Bulawayo's recuperation of the space of the national popular is also visible in the debates women have when Destiny the goat, the wanderer, returns from exile, only to learn that returning is one thing and arriving is quite another. As the women fill her in about the new dispensation and reflect on their service in war, they also debate the value of free, fair, and incredible election. That was the hashtag free, fair, incredible election. Such dialogue leads to the memory of a past before Jidada was Jidada. Past that, quote, back when rocks were so soft, you could pinch them and draw blood, when mountains still were growing, when gods roamed the earth. That past of long, long before greedy colonists came with guns, divided the earth among themselves like there was nobody on it already, flew strange rags in the air called flags, and said, let there be countries. So here we see a clear desire to get out of the world order based on nation states. And yet the novel ends with the fantasy that the military and the police will simply lay down their arms and join the people in the popular uprising. We even witness the creation of a new flag, signaling peace and integrity, memory of the past, and hope for the future. The new national anthem is presented earnestly and not without irony, an anthem that spoke of the kind of glory that burns eternal and glows with living light. This ending sits a bit uneasily with what we've learnt thus far. The bodies of both mother and daughter, Simiso and Destiny, bear the scars from 1983 and from 2008 as an archive of the seat of power's cruelty. Simiso tells Destiny the story of her grandfather, who was also a liberation fighter, who worries that after the war, divisions based on ethnicity, clan, or gender would come to determine definitions of authentic Jidada-ness. If I don't write the true story, he decides, then who will I blame when I wake up one day to find myself in the belly of a crocodile that calls itself history, that devours the stories of everyone else, and goes on to speak for us? In this spirit, Destiny writes The Red Butterflies of Jidada. She reads it out loud in a crowd protesting the rise of another commander, and becomes another martyr to the cause as she's killed. So we can see here that the novel refuses what has perhaps become a reflexive rhetorical move in a lot of scholarship in refugee and migration studies, a call to abolish the nation state, a call to abolish the nation state and advocate for open borders. That the novel marks closure precisely by returning to the very symbols, the flag, the anthem, the martyred body, that attended the first moment of national liberation, demands further debate, or at least I find it very puzzling. Does the ending simply return to the diagnosis offered some 40 or 50 years ago by Benedict Anderson about the need for symbols like the tomb of the unknown soldier or the burning flame, symbols that consecrate the peculiar joining of love and death in the figure of the nation? In other words, does the slain body of Destiny and her recovered history, those are the book she writes, is presumably the novel we read, does this recovered history simply update the symbol at the center, but not displace the categories that keeps this world order based on nations and borders in place? How then might we read the call voiced by the chorus, we need a new world order? Is the novel unable to envision such a new world order? In Scott's terms, we may say that the novel acknowledges the tragedy of post-colonial failure, but reactivates the romance of the nation. In the larger project, I examined quite a few instances of contemporary African diaspora literature returning to the search for national liberation and the language of revolutionary change from the 1960s to 1980s cycle. So apart from Glory, I'm thinking of Shadow King that I mentioned already and How Beautiful We Were, but also Tsitsi Nagaremga's This Mournable Body, Namwali Serpel's The Old Drift, and Nafkote Tamirat's The Parking Lot Attendant. And these are all very different novels. I don't mean to suggest that they're doing the same thing, but all these writers do exhibit a desire to recreate the space of collective struggle and to recover historical memory in what seems like the same way as before. In Glory, the nation is the rubric that promises a transcendence of ethnic strife. Shona and Ndebele, transformed roles for women, a place for the alienated migrant to return and reinvest and become whole. Do we then follow Bulawayo in her turn to the reimagined anthem and flag? Surely, no matter how the valence of nationalism has been misconstrued in the post-colony, we cannot simply return to an outdated vocabulary, especially when it has already been hijacked by post-colonial despots, or what Olufemi Taiwo in another context terms elite capture. Are we then simply doomed to misty nostalgia for the days of racial world-making and dreams of liberation? Or do contemporary forms of the making and unmaking of citizens, let me start again. Do contemporary forms of the making and unmaking of citizenship across the world require us to shift our scales of analysis and rethink the nation and its alternatives in a meaningful way? The question is particularly thorny because Mugabe's power rested also in his ability to hijack the language of anti-imperialism. In the novel, The Old Horse Rants and Raves, what would that USA be without the stolen land it now has the audacity to cordon off with a violent border? What indeed would that country be without the looted sons and daughters of Africa it now keeps in abject poverty when they themselves birthed the country's wealth? Touching on colonialism's ongoing exploitation of Africa's natural resources, gold, diamonds, platinum, tobacco, rubber, tea, coffee, calling for the repatriation of stolen objects in Western museums, the father of the nation thus denounces the West in a long list, and I'll read some of it out. For neocolonialism, for capitalism, for racism, for economic sanctions, for ugly trade practices, for the brain drain, for homosexuals, for the power cuts and the water cuts, for the potholes on the roads and the unpicked trash on the streets, for the defeat of the Jeddah national soccer team at the recent Continental Finals, for the dearth of production of existing works by local poets and writers. So this is, of course, meant to be ludicrous. And it's entirely possible that I'm just missing the joke here. But I wonder what it means for us to reckon with Mugabe's platform of repatriating land to Black Zimbabweans that in the end became one of the causes of his long-awaited downfall and led to some very difficult moments in the Africanist scholarly community in terms of how to assess the meaning of his actions. So reckoning with the aspirations of decolonization in both statist and non-statist forms thus seems key to understanding such contemporary accounts of the post-colony. To do so in a moment when on the one hand, even the dream of equality and democracy across the world seems hopeless, and on the other, to decolonize has become an imperative, so widespread that it's essentially gone viral, leaving the questions writers like Bulawayo explore somewhat in limbo. Thinking further about the grip of narratives of failure on our imagination, about revolutions not just as ruptures, but as endless processes of reinvention and remaking, and pondering forms of political life outside the state, might thus help not only generate a more accurate portrayal of decolonization and its relation to radical thought today, but also force us to confront the stakes of associating the post-colony with failure. Thank you.
Would you like me to
Whatever is easiest.
Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Hey, hey.
Well, we're going to welcome some questions. That would be great.
Just so that people on Zoom can.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I will still project my voice, I guess. We have time for some questions and answers that we'll have in this room officially, and then we'll have an opportunity during the reception to carry on our conversations. But I know there was so much to think about in that brilliant talk, and I loved the way you were able to bring us at its end to the vision for the project as a whole, and sort of have us be thinking about where you're going with all of this work. And I was curious about the pedagogical implications in terms of teaching post-colonial theory and post-colonial literature in the classroom, and how the work you're presently doing is forcing you maybe to change or rethink your process in that regard. So perhaps we could start with that question, and I'll open it up to the audience after.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's really interesting. I think that the question of how this plays out in the classroom is one that I've been thinking about a lot, and in part it's because I started teaching at UCLA almost 20 years ago, and I've just been realizing very, very recently how much the teaching of post-colonialism was really impacted by 9/11 at the time. And I don't know that in the field we've actually grappled with that enough, right? Because so when, in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, like if you're teaching Palestine, for example, which is always a difficult thing to do, there was a particular resistance to anything that seemed to suggest that difference or grievance led to a particular language of revolution, right? So that was sort of a challenge. For me, at least, I'd be curious what it's like here. that dynamic has changed almost sort of, has dramatically changed over the last few years. And some of that is just that, we're not as a society very good at transmitting historical memory. So the students are just too young to remember 9/11, that, they were barely born or they weren't born at that time. But I also think it's because our sense of distance across the world has changed with social media quite dramatically. So again, I always think of this when I first started teaching. I often teach, as I think many of us do, Nervous Conditions, because it's one of the greatest novels to teach. And I would have students sometimes say some stuff like, I'm from Long Beach, I don't even know where Zimbabwe is. And I was like, well, that's why you're in college, right? Like, you can learn. But now I just, that question doesn't come up. It just doesn't come up. So I just finished teaching Glory in a class actually on African American literature, which was also an interesting sort of experiment. So I was teaching 10 novels, and 5 of them were African writers. And so that was a question that students asked at the beginning. That's you really asking us to kind of travel with you. And I'm like, yes, I am. They were a little bit nervous in the beginning about, will we know enough? And then when they read something like Glory, like, it just spoke to them. There's this one really great moment in the novel for people who haven't read it yet, where one of the dictators is having this extended conversation with Siri. And he's basically like asking Siri to tell him how he can become a better dictator. And she keeps kind of translating his questions back to him, saying, so you really want to know how to become a better dictator, right? Like, so just stuff like that. I think, they find these memes of Mugabe falling for me, and they kind of shove it in front of my face during the break and ask me to react. So I feel like it's, for me at least, I think these questions are really, really in the ether. I think we're all thinking about questions of, like, what does it mean to say that our time is weighed down by tragedy and despair? And that in this, in the last sort of 2 decades, we've seen so many massive protests across the globe, and yet we haven't seen a kind of transformation, right? So I think students have this on the mind. Returning to something like James's Black Jacobins has been really wonderful. We have a former graduate student at UCLA, who taught this really wonderful class as part of the lecture program that I was mentioning earlier. So he taught a course on the American catastrophe. His name's Tim Fosbury, and he taught this really great class. And in that, he taught The Black Jacobins. It's a novel about an American catastrophe. And I had a chance to visit the class and watch it. It was amazing to see how the students were just, grappling with sort of real, like historiographical material, the kind of working through the arguments in a way that I cannot imagine this happening 2 decades ago, at least for my part.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. Next question.
Thank you. That was just really fascinating. Unfortunately, I didn't know all of the novels that you were talking about, so sometimes I was a little bit lost, but I appreciate that you had such a broad view. But I was also just wondering, I was actually going to ask you, that was the one thing that kept recurring to me in my mind is about Palestine and other spaces that you wouldn't call post-colonial spaces, that you would consider spaces that haven't achieved a kind of status. And sometimes you see longing for that, but, sometimes you don't, because, there's like discussions of the impossibility of statehood under certain circumstances. So I'm just wondering how you might put in certain kinds of indigenous as well, or Palestinian, or those kinds of novels in conversation with what you're seeing happening in the kind of non-status or the longing for the state in African literatures. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. That's a really, really important question. And I'll first mention a couple of writers who I think take it on in really useful ways. So one is, of course, I mentioned Anne Stoler in Duress. So she thinks about, sort of at the conceptual level, about camp and colony together, right? So she's looking at kind of 19th century French agricultural colonies and so on. And she really wants to think about that alongside the present day camp, right? So for people like Palestinians, stateless people in general. So I think that's something that is a really useful anchor. And then it's just an essay at this point, but I found it incredibly compelling. And the last name of the author is Abu Rahman. I might be mispronouncing that. It was just published in Critical Times. where he takes up, I think he's an assistant professor at NYU of either of geography or urban studies, something like that. And so he takes up sort of exactly the question that you're asking, that what do we make within this discourse of kind of, failed states, decolonization, all of that stuff, but what do we make of the Palestinian example, right? And so he's trying to think about a project that never had any chance of success, right? What would it mean for that to achieve this kind of, so it's a different kind of narrative, right, from the one of failed decolonization. But he's very interested in kind of placing these together and seeing what kind of model of futurity we might derive from that experience. There's one novel in particular that's by a Palestinian writer that is probably going to be part of this project, though most of my examples are from the Black Atlantic world, and it's called Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, and it's just, it's a very grim novel for obvious historical reasons, but it's really one of the most astounding novels I've really ever read. And it takes up some of these questions, I think, in sort of not non-statist in the sense that it's trying to bypass the state, but trying to navigate both kind of physically and conceptually, like trying to move through the city, for example. Through checkpoints, with all the barriers that this young protagonist is facing as she is looking for archival evidence of a massacre that took place in the 50s, right? So it's kind of juxtaposing what happened in the 50s, the unacknowledged massacre that took place, with what's happening today. And she's really very clearly juxtaposing those two moments in some very similar ways to what I'm doing here. The one other thing your question made me think of, and I'm sorry to go to yet another text, but I write about Toni Morrison's novel Paradise in this project, and that is from 1997, and it's a novel that looks at 19th century efforts by African Americans to establish settlements, all black settlements in places like Oklahoma, right? So she's taking up all of these questions of what does it mean, like what does autonomy and self-government mean for dispossessed populations, right? And of course it's a different conversation because it's not going to result in a separate state in the way that it does in the Caribbean or in Africa, but there are a lot of parallels there. So some of the recent scholarship on that novel has really highlighted how that black nationalist project was enabled by the removal of Native Americans precisely from that land in Oklahoma. So that's where precisely I think the questions that you're asking, right, about how do we think about race and settlement together as we try and create new definitions of territory, of belonging in this changed landscape. And so those are, that's not really a response, but just sort of some of the things that I'm thinking of.
Next question over here, Dr. Mariah.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you for your really thought-provoking and just rigorous talk. I was fascinated by the way that during your talk you made comparisons or were inviting us to think about connections between writers like Lorraine Hansberry and Violet Bulawayo, and also even in your answer to Sam's question and thinking about the kinds of work that you do in the classroom. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about what you think sort of decontextualizing African-American literature, or what we might think of as African-American literature in this way does. And if you think there is any kind of distinction that can be made in terms of concerns of writers from the sort of new African diaspora and writers who we might think of as just being African-American.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. It's a question I struggle with quite a lot. And so I teach this one class pretty much every year. It's just called Contemporary African American Literature, and we have we've divided up our courses by period, right? So it's basically 1980s and on, right? Or actually, it's really 1990s on. That's what I'm doing, and we have 5 courses in the sequence that do other stuff. And so I feel like I go back and forth. There are times when it is really a US-based course, and it's really useful to keep it bounded in some ways because it's, we have 10 weeks to get through a lot of stuff, and it's really so, I can stage certain conversations. And I'll give you an example. So for example, I'm really interested in questions of humor and satire, right? That's what draws me to Glory. And so if I do it within the bounds of the US, I have time to, I'll often start with something like Claudia Rankine, Citizen. So I have time to kind of think about questions of trauma, think about questions of, that are raised by really important critics like Saidiya Hartman or Christina Sharp, and kind of do that over 2 or 3 weeks. I often do something LA-based like Anna Deaver-Smith's Twilight, right, that kind of stuff. And then I have time to kind of have a unit of, what I've been thinking of is kind of, this is a very imprecise term, but these self-loathing millennial writers, these women writers, and they're of all races, but so Raven Leilani's Luster, that's one of the novels I teach, and it's a very difficult novel to teach in many ways, but it's staging a very different conversation, right? From, let's say, if I was teaching something like Glory, or How Beautiful We Were, so any of the novels of the New African diaspora, because they're asking you to do sort of slightly different things. I will often, also imagine that class as centrally focused on concepts of identity, community, self-definition, and then the idea of place and our relationship to place becomes really important, right? Migration, nationalism, diaspora. So there's also a way to kind of organize the class in ways that, don't polarize the two. And we can also tap into the much longer history of, globalizing this category is a very, Black studies has always been internationalist, right? It's never been kind of a domestic project. I find that, again, I would be curious what it's like here, but I find that as student demographics change, I have a number of students who are very connected to family members on the African continent in particular, any number of students who are, who have Mexican family members and so on. So they are actually getting more and more interested in thinking about the global. And so often when I teach it just as a US focused class, that's one of the major sort of questions I get, what about the rest of the world? Which is always kind of ironic because that's actually what I work on, but not always, not always bringing it into the classroom. So.
Hello?
Thanks, Sam. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really sorry that I came in late, so I missed the first part of it. But you mentioned a minor detail. Absolutely. Adania Shipley's was possibly the best book I read the year after it came out. And that novel is so quiet. I think the protagonist has one, maybe two conversations through the whole novel, right? And so I'm thinking about that in juxtaposition to Violet Bulawayo's Glory, where it is mostly speech. You cannot help hearing it. When I came in, you were talking about theater and Lorraine Hansberry's theater, which you have to hear. So I was hoping maybe you might tell us something about voice, speech, in the trajectory of this post-colonial, if it will ever be post, right? Also to say that about 3 weeks ago, there was a prize, a history prize that was given, somebody gave, I'm so backwards in this, sorry, forgive me. It was a history prize that was given, I think, was sponsored by a Jewish organization, and somebody wrote a short speech to say that can a new scholar, especially an African scholar, ever say no to such a prize? So I just wanted to talk about, opportunities, Palestine, voice, speech, post-colonial. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. I guess a sort of very small response to the question would be that minor detail to me, and I think most readers would agree, seems really locked in a, it's not reducible to this, but it seems like it's locked in a conversation with Waiting for the Barbarians. And so exactly as you said, the question of, being mute or voice is a really, really sort of central part of how the novel thinks about these questions. I've been thinking about the question that you're asking, like all the noise in Glory, right? Maybe in a slightly different way, but to me it seems like Glory is a novel that wants to be a play. Right? And that's partly why I'm putting it next to Hansberry, right? Because it's a very different, and I normally only write on novels, so it's a little weird for me to go into the go into sort of theater and performance. And I think that for me, not just the cacophony, which is absolutely part of Glory, but the role that the chorus plays in that novel. And again, it's a very, I was really struck as you're reading it that it is, you know, the we the people, so it's obviously about democracy, right? That's what the chorus is obviously doing. But it also seems in many ways like a very traditional Greek chorus. The role is very much to comment on what's happening, to rephrase it. And what's really fascinating about it is that they're not always right? So we watch the chorus, for example, in certain moments, and these are very disturbing, sort of when certain women leaders stand up, or they're making a speech or standing up to the military powers. The chorus has these fantasies of violence against those women, right? And then we kind of watch them over the course of this very long novel kind of get politically educated out of that point of view. So I think that part is what makes me think that there's such an interest in performance, in theatricality, in the spectacle that the dictator creates, that Bulawayo is trying to counter by recreating this kind of cacophony. And that's where all the Twitter, I don't know, for many readers, I actually really enjoyed it, but there are pages and pages that are basically different kinds of Twitter accounts that she's created and that she reproduces. And she's talked about how, as somebody who lives in the United States, kind of again going back to these questions of migration and place and how it changes your sense of what you can and cannot do in relation to the home that you've left behind. So she talked about how she really felt that all these transformations are taking place, and so she first started writing nonfiction, which is really hard for me to imagine Gloria as nonfiction, right? And then it just wouldn't work. And so part of the weirdness of that novel, again, this comes back to the question of voice, is that the animals are not very animalistic. They're just basically like human beings, and so it's actually really distracting in the few moments that you see, they're neighing and hinding, or, they're referred to as males and females without the E. But otherwise, there's no, so it's not like Animal Farm in that sense, right? And it's not even like some of the oral fables that I was referencing earlier. So it really, to me, seems like a way for her, it could also be about avoiding censorship. That seems like, there's a slight displacement that she's created, so she's not actually naming Mugabe, who wasn't named in the first novel in We Need New Names at all, and was sort of conspicuous in his absence. But I think to me it seems like she's really sort of interested in this idea of what a democratic voice of the people, what can that be captured in the form of the novel today? And that's what I see as much of her experimentation as being focused on.
Now, I note that since we do have an opportunity to continue our conversations in a less public forum, unless there are any extremely burning questions, which I'm giving you last call for, if you do have extremely burning questions, then, Dante, okay.
Sorry, hi. This is a very poorly formed question, but it is burning. I liked what you were saying earlier about satire and your interest in it. I'm also very interested in that. And I'm always curious about satire's interaction with these types of topics like decolonialism and all this kind of stuff. And I was wondering if you could talk for a moment, and here's where the question gets bad, because I don't know these books as well that you're talking about. But I'm always curious about how to create a dialogue or sort of address these topics with the text. Like, is it good to, or I want to avoid words like, is it good to? Can you talk about how protest sort of writing or satire works as opposed to a more sort of sincere voice and way of addressing these topics? How does it change the dialogue around it? What do you notice about it? You kind of get where I'm going, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. There's a point in the talk where I say something like, I think this is meant to be earnest. And I think that's partly the question, right? Like, how do we read earnestness, especially in, a wide variety of texts from different contexts and so on. So it's an excellent question. I guess the honest answer would be that I guess I'm trusting myself as a close reader. And I don't know if I should, but that's what I'm doing. So to me, like I'll just give again one example from Glory, just to kind of ground the conversation. There are pages and pages describing how this new flag is being built, and there's children involved in it, right? So that's what I mean by saying it doesn't seem like an ironic thing that she's doing, to me at least, right? And I'm a little bit skeptical of my own reading here because it's very bizarre to end this novel that is such a devastating critique of everything that the nation has been with a desire for recreating it with precisely those same symbols, right? So those are moments where, to me, it seems like it's actually quite clear what the point of the satire is, and it's quite clear what the limits of that satirical voice are, right? Where irony kind of stops, and you can see the author as being kind of invested in a particular kind of ideological narrative. There are other moments when it's very unclear. And so when Mugabe is giving this, and I only gave you a small snippet of that speech, when he's giving this whole speech about, which is, attacking the United States, I mean, I'm completely inside that. And so in part, not all of it, obviously, but what's really hard to know is what do we do with that language of liberation that was historically successful first in creating these new states, right? And then completely hijacked by these despots. So can that, and I think this is why David Scott says, let's move away from it. And there's very good reasons for moving away from it. What I'm interested in thinking about is, instead of just saying that it's so contaminated that we can never get back to it, it's not like we have other alternatives right now that seem that great either. So maybe by turning, especially to writers like Morrison, like Bulawayo, like Hansberry, whom we don't normally think of as offering, for most of the time, we don't normally think of them as offering actual conceptions of democracy or political theory. But to me, it seems like that's what they're doing. And so thinking about some of these questions of genre, right, gets us to, is this, the seriousness of that or the coherence of that ideological project? And in many cases, it's not going to be coherent, and I'm also okay with that, because it can still release some possibilities that we would not otherwise be able to think about.
Amazing. Thank you for that response and all of the responses. I'm struck by how, as academics and as students, we're often anxious that we're not reading enough, and that feeling became very acute in the course of the last hour. But we're so grateful for the journey that you took us along. We have opportunities for further conversation ahead. You see the food's being brought in at the back of the room, and I look forward to the conversations that will unfold. Before we thank together our speaker, I'd like to thank the graduate students. I know what a busy time this is of the term, and your attentiveness and care throughout the term has been appreciated and valued, and you're such a vital part of our community. But now, turning to Dr. Goyal for that amazing talk and for the conversations before and ahead, thank you so much.
Thank you.